In the absence of some defeater, it seems to me that we're perfectly within our rights in believing that there is an objective realm of moral values and duties, just as we're within our rights in believing that there is a world of physical objects around us.
Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special, and we're eager to welcome to the program philosopher and theologian Dr. William Lane Craig. He's also the author of the book On Guard and the president of Reasonable Faith. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. But first, it's spring, the time of year when seeds grow into flower. They do make life insurance easy. Dr. Craig, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
So why don't we start with this? We're living in an increasingly secular age where people, by polling numbers, seculars are now, by polling numbers, the largest religious constituency in America. Why do you think we're seeing such a decline in religious belief in the West right now?
I think what's happening is not so much increasing secularization, Ben, as the collapse of the old mainline Christian denominations like the Episcopalians, the Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and so forth. And as a result, there is an increasing polarization in American society. People are evacuating the middle and going either to the secular end or to the evangelical end. Evangelicals are maintaining their percentage of the American population, keeping up with the population growth. But the impression of increasing secularization exists because the middle is emptying out, and these old line denominations are collapsing.
Why do you think they are collapsing in on themselves? And we're seeing it in Judaism as well. The old conservative Jews and Reform Jews, they're kind of dying away, and you're getting the modern Orthodox movement even moving toward more orthodoxy. Why do you think that's happening right now?
That's very interesting, and I think it's a reflection of the fact that people who are just nominally religious, in a sense, come to the realization that they don't really believe this. And so why should you get up in the dark and the cold on a Sunday morning to go worship somebody you don't really think is there? And so as a result, those who have been simply nominal in their beliefs, I think, are increasingly recognizing that, in fact, they're secular. And the unfortunate byproduct of this is that Christianity has lost its place of cultural influence in the United States as this middle mainline denomination empties out. And it's my hope that in coming decades, increasingly these evangelical denominations, which are holding fast to biblical truth, will begin to assume that position of cultural influence that was once held by the mainline denominations.
Well, Friedrich Nietzsche declared the death of God back in the late 19th century, and it took a while for that to become a reality in the United States. It's, as far as occupying any significant portion of the public mind, we're still significantly more religious than Europe. But starting in the 1960s and moving beyond, there was a real move away from religious belief generally. What do you think presaged that? Why do you think that happened? Considering we have a civilization built on Judeo-Christian values, we're incredibly prosperous, incredibly free, and yet we seem to be moving away from a lot of the religious beliefs upon which our society is based.
Well, I think in Europe and in Canada, it's the lingering shadow of the Enlightenment that swept away the church along with the monarchy, because these two were aligned, and resulted in a deep disaffection with Christianity, which was seen to be aligned with the old order. In the United States, I think it's hard to underestimate the influence of the Vietnam War. That war tore this culture in two and resulted, I think, in the alienation of many, many young people from the values and the beliefs of their elders. And I suspect we're still living with the results of that.
Now, there's sort of a mainstream discomfort with religion that we see these days. Religious believers are seen as sort of anachronistic. If you say that you believe in the Bible or the God of the Bible, then you're seen as somewhat of a fool these days. As somebody who speaks on college campuses a lot, and I speak in purely secular forms about politics, whenever I am asked about religion, it's always phrased in a sense of derision or condescension. Why would you believe all that old stuff? Well, your work has been based on the idea that faith is in fact backed by reason, and that the presence of God is a reasonable assumption to make about the universe. Why do you think that first of all, there's that gap that occurred, that breach that occurred between reason and faith, the two were considered to be mutual buttressing and supportive of one another for centuries? What presaged that gap?
Well, I do think that this is confined to certain disciplines at the university, particularly the soft sciences and the social sciences. Those who were disaffected by the Vietnam War and the Cultural Revolution went into anthropology, sociology, women's studies, literature, religious studies, and so forth. But in the hard sciences, and in my discipline, philosophy, I think, frankly, there's a renaissance of theistic belief. And there is a virtual revolution going on in Anglo-American philosophy right now, where Christian philosophers represent a significant and respected voice in the philosophical community. So I find there's tremendous interest on university campuses in these topics. When I debate a secularist on our university campuses, we will have hundreds and sometimes thousands of students attend these debates. And the discussions are always rational, respectful, deliberative. And so my experience is that there is tremendous interest in our culture and in the university age group in hearing a rational, fair discussion of issues related to religious belief.
Well, one of the things I think that's happened in the religious community is you see people who are brought up in religious homes and they're taught the stories of the Bible. They're never taught any deeper philosophy or theology that attaches to that. So they have sort of a children's eyes view of what God is and how to think about God. You sort of think of God still as the old man in the sky who's controlling things. What in your opinion is the most reasonable proof of God? What have you found to be the most convincing proof of God's existence?
Well, I think that those are two questions. For me, my favorite argument for the existence of God that I find the most compelling is a version of the cosmological argument, which goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something can't just come into being from nothing. Secondly, the universe began to exist. I think we have both good philosophical arguments and scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, from which it follows, third, therefore the universe has a cause. And when you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, you arrive at a being which is an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful personal creator of the universe. So for me, that is a very convincing argument for God. But I find that with university students, that's not the most convincing argument. You can ignore philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past or scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. But the argument that they find, I think, the most compelling is what I call the moral argument. And it would go like this. One, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, in the absence of God, everything becomes socioculturally relative. Two, but objective moral values and duties do exist. There are some moral absolutes, some objective values and duties. Three, therefore, God exists. Now, this is an argument which is impossible, I think, to ignore, because every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you regard them as having intrinsic moral value or whether they are mere means to be used for your ends. And so this argument, I find, tends to be the most convincing for people.
So for purposes of elucidating these arguments, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you a little bit on both of these arguments. Let's start with the cosmological argument that you're making. So the Richard Dawkins comeback, the one that you hear most frequently with regard to the finitude of time and the idea that everything has a cause is, okay, well then what caused God?
Yes. It's important to state the first premise correctly, Ben. It's not everything has a cause. It is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being without a cause. But if something is eternal, never began to exist, there's no need for a cause. So that objection to the argument is simply based on a misunderstanding of the first premise.
What, must we posit such an eternal being, or could we just have an infinity of regressive causes?
Well, that's the second premise, that the universe began to exist. And I think there are deep philosophical problems with the idea of an infinite past. For example, how did we get to today? If you had to go through an infinite number of prior events one at a time, that would be like trying to count down all the negative numbers one at a time ending at zero, which seems an absurd task. Moreover, we have remarkable scientific evidence from the Big Bang expansion of the universe and the thermodynamic properties of the universe, which suggest that the universe cannot be infinite in the past, but must have had a beginning around 13.8 billion years ago. So I think that second premise is very powerfully supported both philosophically and scientifically.
Okay, and then on the other argument, the moral argument, the argument that I've heard made in contravention of that, it's an argument made by Dawkins, Harris, Brett Weinstein, evolutionary biologists, who suggest that morality, there is a certain sense of morality that is innate to mammals that you see even in species that are not our own, a sense of primitive altruism, a sense of kinship protection, for example. So is it possible that that morality is embedded on a very basic level in behavior of mammals beyond the idea of an objective morality that we think about and therefore enact, that it's just embedded in the natural code?
This response is almost a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a point of view by showing how that point of view came to be held. Even if evolution and social conditioning has programmed into us a certain set of moral beliefs, that does nothing to show that those beliefs are false. Indeed, if moral values are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, then our gradual and fallible apprehension of the moral realm no more undermines the objectivity of that realm than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of the physical realm. In the absence of some defeater, it seems to me that we're perfectly within our rights in believing that there is an objective realm of moral values and duties, just as we're within our rights in believing that there is a world of physical objects around us.
So I want to ask you to steelman the opposing argument. So now play atheist. So you're the atheist in the room, and it's your job to attack the arguments that you've just made. What do you think are the strongest objections to the cosmological argument and the strongest objection to the moral argument that you've made?
Well, I think that the first premise of the cosmological argument is unassailable for any sincere seeker after truth. With respect to the philosophical arguments, perhaps what the skeptic might simply say is that infinity is just a really strange thing. And yes, it leads to counterintuitive consequences, but that's just the way things are. With respect to the scientific evidence, he can always hold out hope that the advance of physical theory will overturn the current consensus in astrophysics and cosmology and restore a past eternal universe. And that's about the best he can do, I think. There isn't much prospect for that, but he could hold out hope.
So in a second, I want to ask you about the Bertrand Russell theory that essentially posits brute facts in place of God as the beginnings of these sorts of arguments. But first, hiring is challenging, but there is one place you can recruiter the smartest way to hire. So philosopher Bertrand Russell suggested that God is sort of unnecessary to these conversations, that instead of trying to look for a final cause, this is just the way things are. So in other words, if you go back to the very beginning, okay, so something sprang from nothing. Why not?
This is a different cosmological argument that Russell was responding to. This argument goes something like this. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Number two, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then its explanation is a transcendent eternal cause. Premise three would be the universe exists. And from that, it follows logically that therefore the explanation of the universe is an external transcendent cause. Now, what Russell denied was the first premise. He said that there doesn't need to be an explanation either in the necessity of a thing's nature or in an external cause. Now, I disagree with Russell on that, but notice that that skeptical response doesn't apply to the first version of the cosmological argument, because in that case, we're talking about something that begins to exist, something that comes into being. And I don't think even Russell would have affirmed that something could come into being without a cause, even if for some eternally existing universe, you might say, well, it just exists with no explanation.
So one of the counters that's sort of been posited nowadays to that idea is the sort of David Hume, well, things pop in and out of existence, and people tend to point to quantum mechanics as the basis of this. So how do you respond to the quantum mechanical argument that it appears that certain particles are almost literally winking in and out of existence?
Let me first respond to Hume on this, because I think he's been misunderstood. What Hume said was that you cannot prove the causal principle either by demonstration or intuition. But he said in a letter to John Stewart, I never affirmed anything so absurd as that something could come into being without a cause. I only said that it's not proved through demonstration or intuition. Now, in quantum mechanics, things don't come into being out of nothing. The quantum vacuum is definitely not what the layperson means by vacuum, namely a state of nothingness. The quantum vacuum is a sea of roiling energy, having a rich physical structure and governed by physical laws. It is most emphatically not nothing. And therefore, when people like Lawrence Krauss and certain others say, well, the modern physics shows that something can come from nothing, this is a deliberate abuse of science and is grossly misrepresentative of, in fact, what the science says.
So I'm going to go through one more argument with you, and then I want to talk about the importance of religion as opposed to theology, which are not quite the same thing, because you're making some reason-based arguments for the existence of God, but these aren't obviously arguments for Christian revelation or Jewish revelation or anything like that.
No, though I do think there are good reasons to be a Christian theist. That's
sure.
also part of my work.
And I want to get to that in just one second. But I first want to tackle another argument that you hear made a lot, and that seems, I think, to be given short shrift. The ontological argument, the St. Anselm argument. So the ontological argument, if you could spell that out, and then why people seem to get this so wrong, because the way they posit it is that it's this simplistic argument, and if we just posit an island, then you could somehow debunk it, which would make no sense, because any person could have discovered that when St. Anselm said it, as opposed to spending hundreds of years trying to figure it out. So what is the ontological argument?
The ontological argument, in a nutshell, says that if it's even possible that God exists, then it follows that God actually exists. And this argument has been stated and defended with great sophistication by philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, for example. And I, like you, am persuaded that this is actually a sound argument. And basically what Plantinga says is, define a maximally great being to be a being that is metaphysically necessary, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. Now, if it's possible that there is such a being, then there's a possible world in which that being exists. But if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, it exists in all possible worlds. That's part of what it means to be maximally great. Therefore, it exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. And the steps of this argument, your viewers may be surprised to learn, are actually relatively uncontroversial. The whole argument stands or falls with the first premise. Is it possible that a maximally great being exists? If you think it's possible that God exists, then you ought to believe that God actually exists. The atheist has to say not merely that God does not exist, but that it's impossible that God exists.
So the typical comeback doesn't even meet this argument. So just for the folks who haven't studied the ontological argument at all, the typical comeback is, imagine a maximally great island, the greatest island you've ever heard of. Well, then it must exist, by using the exact same principles here. But what you would say is there's no possibility of a maximally great island, because that description is simply too vague. There's no way to actually
that would be one of the problems with it. What contributes to the greatness of islands? Do you prefer a desert island or one chocked with hotel resorts? there isn't any really objectively such a thing as the greatest conceivable or maximally great island. So it turns out that these attempts to parody the argument by talking about a maximally great pizza or a necessarily existent lion all fail because they postulate incoherencies. When the idea of a maximally great being, that is to say, a being that is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every possible world, does seem to be an intuitively coherent and therefore possible idea.
So how do we get from the idea of an unmoved mover in some of the arguments that you've been making to the idea of a moral God who cares about us and is involved in the world?
Well, it's quite right that arguments like the cosmological argument or the teleological or design argument, which we haven't talked about, don't get you the moral properties of the creator and designer of the universe. But the moral argument and the ontological argument do. Both of those lead to a being which is the moral paradigm and source of all moral value and moral obligation. And so those arguments complement the cosmological and teleological arguments by telling us something about the moral properties of the creator and designer of the universe.
Now, looking at those properties, what makes that being a God of mind? What makes that, and what makes that being constant, meaning like present now, as opposed to the kind of deistic conception of a God who laid things in motion, maybe embedded moral codes within us, and then walked away? What makes God something that is present in the universe at the moment on any level?
Okay, now there's a couple of questions there. First, with regard to why I think this is a mind, most all of the arguments that I just shared do lead to a personal, intelligent creator. The first argument does. The teleological or design argument leads to a cosmic intelligence that has created the world. The moral argument leads to a personal embodiment of moral value, because persons are the source of moral value, not inanimate things. The ontological argument leads to a being who is omniscient and morally perfect, and therefore is a person. So these theistic arguments don't just leave you with some kind of unmoved mover. They give you a personal creator and designer of the universe who is perfectly good. Now, some of them give you a being that is metaphysically necessary. The second version of the cosmological argument that I mentioned leads to a being who exists by a necessity of his own nature and therefore cannot fail to exist. The moral argument leads to a being who is the paradigm and source of all moral value. Now, if you believe that some moral values are necessary, which most ethicists do, that means this being is also necessary in its existence. And therefore, having demonstrated that a being like that exists, it cannot fail to be present in the world today. That means that this being also exists now. It couldn't cease to exist. Now, that still leaves open the question of deism. Has this creator and designer of the universe, perfectly good, revealed himself to us in some way that we can know him more personally? Or has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he's made? That's still an open question to talk about.
Okay, so let's talk about that question. Now, the proofs that you're talking about, many of them can be traced back to Aristotelian roots.
Yes.
Aquinas obviously talks about a lot of these proofs himself, but he's getting them from Aristotle because they're also present in Maimonides. They're present in a lot of other
Maimonides has the same argument.
So with all of that said, that sort of brings us to the Tertullian question, which is, okay, so why do you need Jerusalem? So we've got Athens, you've got this idea of,
yes,
of a God that's present in the universe and that has a moral component to him,
yes,
is the unmoved mover, all of these things. So why do you need the idea of a revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God, and I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even that there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this: why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the Ben Shapiro Show's Sunday special is a Daily Wire production. Copyright Daily Wire 2019.